won't be good. So here we are. Before we get started, I know Dan, you had sent me a note about an interaction you had this last week, and I thought maybe that might as well share it up front and be good as time as any.
Yeah, thanks for that. I got really lucky. Actually went to visit my mother-in-law, took my wife up to Birmingham, Alabama, and somebody she knew asked me if I wanted to meet Gene Cushman. And I didn't even know who he was until I looked him up, but he was a Army Air Corps pilot, started flying in 1942, and then flew all the way through 1969, which is pretty incredible because that kind of covers the whole focus of where we've gone so far in this class up till now. And I was lucky enough to have a one-on-one interview with him for about an hour, and then went out and had lunch with him there near where he lives. Yeah, he flew 42 military airplanes throughout his career. Was able to get a total of 56 logged before he finished flying. Of course, every pilot, when you hear somebody's flown that many airplanes, your first question is, what's your favorite? And he told me that the P-40 and P-51 were his favorite to fly, although he really did enjoy the jets as well. One of the first things I asked him once I kind of let him go through his own introduction was, what was his experience in the Army Air Corps and how did that change as he transitioned to becoming a U.S. Air Force member? And he said that for the most part, it was a transparent transition. And as far as he would look at it from a career standpoint, it was a no effect whatsoever. He said one day they were Army and the next day they were Air Force, but everything else just went on as ordinary. Their chain of command obviously transitioned with them. So to people at the operational level, it was a completely transparent transition. And I asked him later on, I was like, at what point did you identify as an Air Force member versus a Army member, and kind of see a bit of a divide there? And he said that at no point through his career did he ever feel any sort of barrier between where he had come from as a Army Air Corps member, and then going through the rest of his career under the U.S. Air Force umbrella. So he almost was against any of the kind of rivalries that we bring up. He said in his mind, going through World War II and even seeing Vietnam, he was just a U.S. military member, and that's how he viewed himself. He was fortunate enough to be a pilot flying for the Air Force throughout all of that. Moving on a little bit to kind of the World War II and the Berlin airlift stuff. Even though he started flying in 1942, he was a pretty gifted pilot. So once he started flying the P-40s and P-51s, the Air Force or the Army Air Corps benefited more by keeping him as an instructor stateside. So he was training fighter pilots on those warbirds stateside. And then at the end of the war, he had transitioned to being stationed in Hawaii and was flying cargo. He got notified that he was going to Berlin for the airlift, and said that from the time he was notified there at Hawaii till the time he was strapping in, starting up and taking off to fly all the way over to Germany was less than an hour. And then he says that out of his whole career, training fighter pilots for World War II, participating in the airlift, and then obviously seeing a little bit of kickoff for Vietnam, although he was a test pilot during the Vietnam conflict. He said the most significant portion of all of that was his role in the Berlin airlift. I believe he said he flew C-54s and was a part of the 3-minute interval windows where they would go in all weather, all 24-hour operations, and they would get these supplies into Berlin. He said the scariest moment of the airlift was when he realized he had already landed before he saw the runway. And then as the nose came down is when he finally saw the runway lines, which to, somebody flying a modern day aircraft, I'm a gunship front seater myself. It's like I wouldn't even trust myself to fly down to minimums on the type of equipment they had back then, let alone put the wheels down. So it's definitely mind blowing, the talent and the risk those guys were willing to accept to get that mission done, and that they viewed it that important that they were willing to accept that level of risk.
That's
I asked
insane.
him a little bit about the joint side of things. I said, you know, what was it like being a part of the Air Force throughout all of your experiences, but then getting to work in foreign countries with international partners, as well as some of the joint interactions. And he said he had the utmost respect for all of the European counterparts that he worked with. And he said, especially the support level they received from the Germans during the Berlin airlift is an often overlooked piece of how important that worked out for them to keep the logistics functioning there, while the U.S. was sending in nonstop supplies, was noteworthy. Moving on to kind of get through the rest of this stuff. He said he had interactions with General LeMay, and became well enough known that LeMay asked him to take a bit of a lead as a test pilot as they began working towards the jet bombers. So they took him a little bit out of the fighter flying and the transport that he was doing. And he worked with SAC as a B-47 test pilot, and then eventually in the B-52s. He said that was a bit of a downer for him, even though it was a direct request from LeMay, mainly because he missed the performance of flying the jets. One thing that was kind of noteworthy, just from a perspective of culture, was, you know, and I've read the same thing also from Fighter Pilot with Robin Olds, is, you know, back then you were just a pilot in the mind of the Air Force. You got your wings, you could fly planes. It was so much different than the way it is now with all of the certifications and qualifications. So after he got checked out and was flying the props, the World War II era warbirds, one day he walked out onto a ramp, and this was later on, you know, like a decade later or something, they had an F-84 sitting out there. And he walked up to the crew chief and said, hey, what does it take to fly this? Got about a 2-hour verbal lesson, hopped in, fired it up, took it up for a spin around the pattern, and realized they had locked out the wingtip fuel tank. So he was able to land it with about full aileron stick deflection right as he was in the flare to keep it from rolling over on him. But that was just the way things were done back then. And you know, he kind of laments the way things are now, hearing from me as well as others that have kind of relayed the paperwork, the regulation side, and how limited aviators are these days versus the freedom they had back in the day. But the only last thing I'll kind of mention, just kind of interest, is he said to his knowledge, he's the only one who's done a 10-engine takeoff on the B-52. Which I did the math. I was like, there's a lot of engines on that, but I'm pretty sure there's 2 on each pylon and 4 on each wing, so 8. I was asking him how he got an extra couple engines, and he said they were taken off with the Hound Dogs, which was a air-to-ground cruise missile. I looked up some of the details. It was actually nuclear capable, but it had a turbojet engine in the cruise missile that apparently they could control prior to release. And so part of his test ability, I guess the clout he carried as a test pilot, he said, hey, let's try this thing with the Hound Dogs spooled up. So before takeoff, they revved up the Hound Dogs to full power, and then they brought all 8 normal jets up and did a 10-engine takeoff in the buff. He said it was by far superior to any of the 8-engine takeoffs he had done. And they could take off with heavier weight if they would have adopted that as a standard procedure. But, you know, just to completely bring it all back, I would say my interaction with him, it was shocking talking to a 102-year-old veteran of World War II who'd been an aviator his whole career. And despite his age, you would have never known it just in the interactions. He remembered things I had told him when I introduced myself and brought it up towards the end of our hour-long conversation, which was amazing. And, sometimes I wonder as a pilot, I'm like, what are the physical and mental tolls that are going to be evident later in my life from the demands of flying? But apparently this guy is proof that you can make to 102, fly for a whole career and still be in good health and mental state. But yeah, thanks for the time, Colonel Beer, Lieutenant Colonel Beer, for let me share that interview. I just figured it was pretty relevant for the period of time we were talking about in this class right now.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that, Dan. That living history, and those folks from that generation, what a treasure, and they're not going to be around that much longer. So that's really cool. You had a chance to experience that and talk with him, and it, wow, the breadth of experiences he had, like you said, it really overlays everything that folks are reading about and learning about this week. So that's cool.